In this video, we're going to talk about racial representation in anime and the arguments people have put forth as for why there isn't an excuse, like anime needs to have more racial representation. I made a Reddit thread basically discussing my own opinion about it. I am a Puerto Rican. I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, but my family's Puerto Rican, and I saw a video recently of somebody talking about how anime needs more racial representation, and to me, that they were talking about like other things, like how people struggle to for example, cosplay if they're like black or brown, because people will say, oh, like you don't fit that character. I think that is a separate issue of just people IRL being racist, rather than like the issue being like anime doesn't have enough black and brown characters. I mean, I saw a black woman as Bakugo at Anime Expo, I think, and she was badass. I don't give a fuck, like what you look like, if you look like the character profile or whatever. If you just look good, you look good in it, like I don't care, so like my that I like to see diverse people in anime. Like, one of the reasons I really love Yuri on Ice was because there were all these representations of other countries like coming together to do the ice skating thing. So I really do like representation, and I think it's good when we do get it. I just feel like there are definitely anime tourists, and one of the things that they will insist that anime has a problem with is that, they don't have enough racial representation in anime. And when I made this Reddit thread, my argument was essentially that, like, basically, most anime takes place in Japan or like an isekai, and it's not, y'all who are asking for this are usually Americans or like from somewhere in like North America. Y'all are like projecting our racial history in this country and all that comes with it. You're projecting it onto like a different country and saying like, y'all gotta like y'all gotta get with it and put these characters into your anime, because it's problematic if you don't. And one of the things that people said in this thread is that, well, I've never seen people say this, or very few people say it, that anime needs more representation. And that's true, but something to keep in mind is that, yes, few people start these conversations, but when you do see somebody start these conversations, part of the reason this is stuck with me, even though like I would technically not very often see these kind of conversations, though part of that is because I don't use Twitter, because I was fucking tired of seeing this kind of shit like constantly. But when I would see conversations about representation in anime, there were a lot of people who agreed. There were a lot of people who were wanting to see more representation in anime. And to me, again, it just doesn't make sense, because anime comes from Japan. And now, when I or other people point that out, people will say, oh, well, you're infantilizing Japan. Like, Japan can have representation. They could do the research and all that. And it's like, This isn't about infantilization. The problem is y'all are treating this like a moral issue. And it's not. Because y'all are, again, projecting racial representation, what that looks like, what that entails. The conversation in America, you're projecting that expectation to a country that is literally 97% Japanese. They have, other racial groups, such as like the indigenous, specifically the indigenous groups like the Ainu people and, those people who were like originally, the people living in Japan who now live in the most northern land of Japan. You have those people. And I mean, whether or not that's a conversation about like representation or, whatever conversation there is about that in Japan, I mean, that's, like a conversation in Japan. Like that would be their conversation around race, like there's certainly, white, black, brown, all these different people who happen to live in Japan, but they are a small percentage of the people who actually lived in Japan. Like most non-Japanese people you see in Japan are tourists, only there temporarily. And especially right now, if you know anything about, like Japan today in 2025, like people have a at least somewhat negative opinion about people from outside Japan because of all the TikToks, pranks, and all that bullshit that a lot of these people have been, doing when they're in Japan. Starting with Logan Paul, but it's gotten especially bad, years later. So, like, coming back to the representation in anime, I mean, what does it look like when you make an anime and, like, you put people in there when, like, a lot of the impression that Japanese people have of these people in their, like, personal lives is, like, they or their friends, like, dealing with one of them pulling a prank in, like, a language they don't even, like, understand all that well. And again, this isn't infantilizing. This is just understanding, one culture and one country versus another. It's understanding where different countries are at, what they value, what's important to them in like media and, politics and all that. And understanding that the way America sees racial representation and inclusion, and the broadness that it entails in America is just not, it's just not how they see it in Japan, because they don't have that, like, demographic, essentially. Like, they don't, it's a lot, black, brown, people of different races are a lot less common in Japan versus America. So now I'm just gonna go through like other arguments that I saw when I made this thread. Cause it's funny because like on YouTube, whenever this comes up, like the demands that anime tourists have, for Japan to change how they like create anime, like what kind of characters and all that. Most of them, including Japanese people who, speak English or just like, type out in Japanese, like this is not an issue in Japan. If you go to these anime tourist videos where people talk about anime tourists and specifically, them trying to change what anime looks like, look in the comments, you will probably see, at least in some of these videos, like Japanese people speaking up against, like these expectations. Another argument I saw in this thread was people saying, like, oh, I mean, but anime has, like, people with elf ears and, like, blue hair. You know, what's so hard about putting black and brown people in anime? You know, I keep saying black and brown people, you know, because that's usually what people are looking for with these representation conversations. And I mean, I appreciate y'all, like, looking out for black and brown people, but, you know, don't get me wrong. I want to emphasize, you know, I'm no Asmongold. You know, I love when I do see different people from different countries, you know, in random anime. But it's just not something that, like, you know, Japan should be, like, held to this expectation of, you gotta do better, Japan. Because, again, it's not a moral issue. You know, it's like, I don't know. It's like going to an Italian restaurant and being angry because they're not inclusive enough. They didn't have any, like, sushi or, like, donburi bowls in their menu. That's literally what you guys are doing. You're expecting donburi at an Italian restaurant. Like, come on. And, you know, going back to the blue hair elf people, like, that, I guess, brings up the point of, like, what is good representation of people? Because, like, you know, a lot of people in this thread were saying, like, oh, when we say, you know, people aren't saying we want more representation. We're usually saying that we want good representation. And yes, like, they've decided, like, every or most, like, representation they see in anime is, like, too stereotypical. And I've certainly seen characters who are more on the stereotype side. Like, you know, that's a fine argument. But, like, then it brings up the conversation of, like, you know, for some people, just having, you know, black or Spanish or Muslim characters in anime is enough. You know, like, they just happen to be a certain race and, you know, they just live whatever life. That's enough for them. For other people, no, there has to be, you know, an integration of, like, you know, their specific background. And especially when you need that for good representation, I mean, that takes a lot of research and, like, going, you know, people going out of their way to, you know, make a good representation by that standard. And there are certainly people who have done that. Mangaka, you know, people, different people, like, behind anime who have gone out of their way to do that. Because they did want to add characters. They did want to tell those stories, you know? And that was, like, what they wanted to do. And usually when they put in that effort, they do well. It's just that it's not necessarily something everyone wants to do. And if you try to push people to do shit that their heart isn't actually in, you are going to get what a lot of you consider bad representation. So that's why it's not as simple as, you know, changing the aesthetic of a character, you know, like the whole, like, elves with blue hair debacle. You know, it's, for some people that would be enough, but for some people that isn't enough. But an example of that is the whole Genshin Impact Natlan situation, where Natlan is one of the newer lands in Genshin Impact, and people were expecting it to be, you know, it was inspired by, supposedly, like, Mexican, Latin American, you know, ancient lands. It had a lot of, like, Spanish influence, you know, that's what the developers were saying, apparently. And yet, all but, like, one of the characters did not have, like, tan skin like this, you know, they had like pale skin. And, you know, to me, I'm like, I mean, if they are just like acting like regular Genshin Impact characters, I mean, it's not a huge deal. Would it be cool? Yeah, but like, you know, it would definitely add diversity. But, you know, if all they're doing is like being regular Genshin characters, but they're like different skin tones, I mean, to me, I mean, it's really not, you know, not like needed. Because again, it's cool if you have like, if you were to have like Spanish people, you know, black people in Genshin, you know, just to have like what feels like a fuller world altogether. But if like all you're mad about is like skin tones, it's like, it doesn't really make a huge difference, you know? Like, one argument people put to that, not saying it's like justified, but, you know, in China where Genshin is developed, pale skin is like the beauty standard. And I guess that is more important than having more realistic, you know, having more realistic like Latino characters, especially when they don't, you know, especially when they aren't different versus like characters who aren't, you know, Latinos in this world. So, you know, there's that. I'll try to remember to at least put this Reddit post in the description. But part of the reason I'm talking about this is when I was growing up, I've been watching anime since 2002. Like, I was the typical, you know, started off with Pokemon at night on Cartoon Network, and then like Toonami eventually, Adult Swim, you know, like occasionally catching like Case Closed on Adult Swim, you know. And like one of the things when I was in middle school that got me into anime, like new anime, was anime reviews and anime critiques. Nowadays, while most anime critique is the same kind that we've had previously, there's definitely a significant uptick of people who are criticizing anime, not because, you know, the story or the art, you know, could be better, but because like there isn't enough representation. You know, to them, like the main woman being like weak, even just at the beginning, is like, you know, a sign that the author's sexist, you know, or doesn't know how to write women characters at all and never does, you know, write them well, you know. Like, look at Naruto, and Sakura is like proof that Kishimoto can't write women characters. Oh, look, there's Tsunade, but I guess we're not going to talk about her. You know, you had shit like that. You know, the one that ticked me off the most, though, that was so fucking wild, was this 3-hour critique of My Hero Academia. I was so excited about, because I love My Hero Academia, but as like a writer, I do love seeing people point out its flaws and, you know, how it could be better. But this woman was going off. Like, probably one of her wildest takes was that Shoto's family was like a Asian stereotype of like parents like beating up their kids for not being good enough. Like, that was like her interpretation of like Shoto's storyline, is that it was a bad Asian stereotype. Like, that's where some people are with like critiquing anime. And that's why this shit really fucking annoys me. Cause like, these people are so unserious, yet they are serious. You know, it's so fucking wild. Like, again, this may not be brought up a lot of times, but when it is brought up, you do get a lot of people who are huge advocates of it. Like, case in point, when I made this thread that I made on Reddit, I mean, you had a good amount of people saying like, bro, I never hear about this. But you most certainly had a lot of people who were very supportive of the idea that anime does need to get better at being, you know, more racially diverse. But again, that's like America coded. And that's what people, I'm presuming Americans, can't wrap their heads around. Is that you're talking about a whole different country and a whole different continent with a whole different history, you know, with a whole different culture, you know? Like one good point someone brought up was like anime is mainstream now and people treat it like any of their, you know, American choices of like media as in like a default media of sorts. And like America just needs to, like, anything their Americanized see needs to meet this like standard of representation. And it's like they don't understand that, again, this is, you know, Italian food, not the sushi that they were expecting, you know, not the sushi that, you know, they would prefer. Like anime essentially has, in a way, through becoming mainstream and like presenting like isekai stories, not always necessarily in Japan, open itself in the eyes of Americans apparently to like representation expectations that like aren't realistic if you really think about the situation. I feel like too in isekai anime, I mean, the argument can go either way. Like the creator can make whatever world they want with like whatever characters, whatever cultures. So like you could maybe see, you know, a lot of black people and brown people and all these other like non-Japanese people in your world, in your isekai. Like it would be easier, but again, in a country where you don't have that much like in-person authentic interaction with people of different races and cultures, it's, you know, not as likely, you know, to happen. In an American, you know, live action or, you know, animation, yeah, you know, you're more likely to see a more diverse world, you know. But another thing too, I mean, when it comes to representation, I mean, it's a weird thing to me, you know, like, because I myself am Puerto Rican, but I don't represent like your typical Puerto Rican, what you might expect. Like, I don't know Spanish, you know, I don't have Spanish friends. I mean, I'm just friends with people who like the shit I do. I don't really, you know, like a lot of people, I don't necessarily like gravitate toward people of the same culture as me, and, you know, like that may or may not be the same expectation. Like to be fair too, it's not bad to just want to see more people of different races in your anime, but it gets bad when it becomes like an expectation, you know? Like when it becomes like, oh, you know, Japan or anime is inherently bad because, you know, they don't have the diversity I want in it. And like, my opinion, as long as the character isn't like a walking stereotype, I think, you know, like it's fair representation. Again, because like, you know, there are all sorts of people with different, you know, life circumstances, despite whatever background they may have been born into, you know, that like will look super different all the freaking time as far as like how we behave, you know, who we are friends with and all that stuff. People will also be like, oh, but anime throws in like European representation, and it's like, if you're just talking about characters with like yellow hair or blonde hair, that doesn't automatically mean that they are, from a European country. Some are. You have like Vinland Saga, Attack on Titan. You have characters like that, but they're not really necessarily like European coded either. Like, as far, they are just like they're barely there type of representation a lot of the time. Like, if like you have like Momichi from Fruits Basket, who speaks German here and there, like, he, like, his German heritage, it's like really tied into his story, so he would be like the ideal representation. But like, you do have that, but you also have characters like Attack on Titan characters who don't necessarily tie into like their actual like German roots in that same way, so like, just because representation doesn't like meet your standards doesn't necessarily make it bad. And Attack on Titan is still hugely successful, and people just think, all the German names are a good, like a good bonus. Some people were going as far as like assuming that I was doing some kind of weird dog whistle because, I was saying there like, yo, stop complaining so much about, like low racial representation in anime. Like, I kind of do feel like, critics who complain about this are like leaning too much into American politics, like, it's not being against those politics, it's about people applying them into the wrong place. And while Japan has tourists and like you can integrate them into your story, and you can integrate the rare people who do live in Japan who are of different races into your story, it's not like a must, because these people are kind of rare. Japan doesn't have the best opinion of at least some of the tourists who come through Japan anyway. And also, a lot of people were saying like, oh, I'm not like too worried about like having more people of like different races in anime, but if they do put people of different races, they better do it right. That's the thing, that takes a lot of research. So if y'all are going to be putting as much scrutiny as these people are saying that they would on characters of different races in an anime, I mean, the minute, people catch wind that like, oh yeah, like, it's, like, if somebody who's making a manga or an anime, kind of like sees like, oh, like, these Americans, they're gonna be real fucking, like, they're gonna really scrutinize whatever attempt I make to, create certain characters. Some people take that as a, healthy challenge. Some people look at that and they go like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to deal with y'all fucking, hyperfixating on like some like details I get you wrong about like a specific background. It's so funny because like clearly people had enough of a problem with me kind of like stating my opinion that like, oh, like, you don't necessarily need, to always have like a diverse cast in an anime. Like, the thread got locked, and I don't know, I kind of feel like overall a lot of the people who did comment on this were being really judgmental of like my intentions of why I posted this, and it's really just, I'm tired of people, like deciding anime can't, like, essentially the way that they do talk about the shit when they do, it's like anime cannot stay the way it is. It's problematic because it doesn't have the characters that I want it to have, and therefore it needs to change. And it's just like, anime's just, like, there is variety, and sure, there are characters who end up being, nothing but stereotypes, and that's bad. But it's like, let authors, do what they want. I think that is definitely my biggest problem with these kind of complaints. It's not that you want, racial diversity in an anime, but that you're demanding other people change the story they want to tell so that it includes things that you want. Because again, for a lot of these people, it's not enough to just have, black characters, brown characters, or anything like that. They have to actually be, a certain, like, they have to, like, have, like, a certain, like, storyline of, like, I came from potentially, like, this American state, or, like, I have this background, like, one of my parents is non-Japanese, having these characters, if you, like, give any shit about, like, how your audience will receive these characters as an author, and because, like, audience reception does, essentially pay the bills, through, like, how successful your, manga or anime is. I mean, those opinions do play a part in, like, how much money whatever manga or anime makes. So because these people are talking about it, because these people have all these opinions, like, that, impacts if you were to go along with, like, adding characters you didn't initially plan to add to appease the audience. That does change, even in little ways, like your story that you're trying to tell. And again, it's like, that's why it annoys me, because I want people to write their honest stories, like whatever characters they want to put in their stories, whatever story they want to tell. That's the best part of any story, is, like, seeing what kind of story this author wants to tell, absent of, like, any, extra shit that, like, editors tell them they gotta put in to appease, like, audiences. But with anime, I mean, they're usually not even going to necessarily, care about what Americans say. It's just, like, a lot of these people will, like, go on to, like, harass the author, or, like, just, like, badmouth the author because, like, they didn't add the kind of characters that, they wanted to be in this anime, or, like, especially so, like, the characters they did add were not good representations in their mind. It's like, apparently there are people who say like, oh, this character is, who's clearly black in this anime, they actually aren't black, and that's not okay, like that. Yeah. That's dumb, like if people are being weird, like I don't like, if I when I see videos of like, oh, video games are too woke or whatever, like nah, you know, like because most of those are bad faith videos, and like, well, there can be a conversation had about like, are video game studios or animation studios, when they add characters, are they adding it because like people want them to add it? Are they adding it, so they profit from token characters, or are they genuinely excited to like have them in their stories? Because they genuinely want like a diverse cast. That would be my kind of like question for that conversation. But aside from that, having a trans character in your video game is not like a sin or anything. It's good to have a variety of characters. It's just like, it does boil down to like the reason you have the character in there. But I ain't going to like question it when the character is there, like when I see like a trans or a black or a brown or whatever character, or a lizard character, maybe the lizard is like a political analogy, I don't fucking know. Like one person said like, oh, I'm sure Japan is like 90% high schoolers because that's all who show up in anime. And it's like, that's a demographic thing of like who specifically watches anime, which are high schoolers a lot of the time. And a lot of people who watch anime in high school have grown up, and they can still enjoy at least some of the anime involving high schoolers. But there are a few, there are more and more adult anime coming out where like, it's still like PG, nothing crazy. It's just like adults, like living their lives and, going through relatable things, or even going through isekai adventures. But that's because more people, more adults are, watching anime and like expressing interest and, enjoying these anime with adult characters. Similarly, I mean, anime is more likely to have Japanese characters if they are going to give their characters like a national slash racial identity, because most people watching anime, at least the market that these companies that make anime care about the most, are Japanese. Annoying how many people are like, this problem doesn't exist, man. Shit's fist at the clouds. Some people brought up, like, there are different levels of, like, tan skin amongst Japanese people, and I think if anything that deals more with, like, beauty standards in Asia, at least East Asia, of, like, like, the paler skin you have, the better you look, potentially through all of Asia. And yeah, like, that is more a beauty standard than, like, a racial thing. So yeah, like, when it comes to this conversation, I mean, maybe I would get different results if I posted this in a anime related subreddit, because I posted this in a subreddit called character rant, which is just like general fiction and more, more so people who maybe like less familiar with anime, like have less interaction with the community if you actually ask them, like, but yeah, like a lot of people like thinking I have like some kind of issue just because like they haven't seen the conversation. But in comment sections of like, people like Chibi Reviews who, have talked about like anime tourism generally, not specifically like the racial breakdowns and representation in anime, just like anime tourism specifically, you got a lot of people who just do not like seeing people trying to change anime, trying to insist, because again, that's how they talk about this. It's not just like, oh, it'd be cool if we had more, black people or brown people. It's like people who are like, nah, anime needs more of this. And if not, they have, they are problematic. Like the makers of anime are problematic if they can't figure out putting more black and brown people in anime. Love to show you this kitten, but she does not like being lifted. But yeah, like if you want to see more job advice videos, which is what I'm usually posting here, in my previous video I discussed why tailoring your resume isn't as needle moving as you might expect, as far as like what companies will actually like be interested in talking to you. So check that out. Otherwise, feel free to like and subscribe if you did enjoy this conversation. Comment, how you feel about this, good or bad, or like whatever. Thanks so much for watching. Also, hi.